Google just announced Gemini 3, progressing from understanding to thinking to action with their frontier AI model. This includes Nana Banana image generation, anti gravity coding assist. What should we make of Gemini 3 apart from their use of crazy code names? We also discuss in browser AI and coding assistants, as well as news from Microsoft Ignite, including Fabric IQ, Work IQ, and Foundry IQ on this episode of Utilizing AI. Welcome to Utilizing AI, the weekly podcast focused on practical applications of artificial intelligence from the Futurum Group. Each episode brings together diverse perspectives to explore news and new use cases for the ways in which AI is transforming enterprise IT and the industries it serves. I'm your host, Stephen Foskett, president of the Tech Field Day business unit here at the Futurum Group. Before we dive into the discussion, let's meet who's on the panel today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brad Shimmin. And Stephen, thanks for having me. I'm an analyst with the Futurum Group looking at data intelligence, analytics, and infrastructure. And I'm an unapologetic believer in all things AI. So bear that in mind as we go.
And I'm Nick Patience on the AI platforms practice lead here at Futurum. I've been looking at AI for 25, almost 26 years now. I agree with Brad. I am an unapologetic supporter of AI as well.
And I'm Stephen Foskett. I guess I'm the designated skeptic here. Now, I'm unapologetically enjoying and using it. In fact, I did some really cool stuff with it this week. But I am a little skeptical of the business model and financials of the whole thing. But we'll get to that. Not on this episode, though, because we've had actually some new announcements this week. Key among those, of course, is Gemini 3 from Google. And I was thrilled to see that, a little bit of inside baseball here. Google actually made this announcement in a university setting. And the first official discussion of it was with a bunch of young people who are just getting into the industry. And I love that vibe. I also really enjoy Gemini. I've been using Gemini as my sort of go-to engine for a while now, just sort of to get stuff done during the day, along with, of course, Apple Intelligence. And Gemini 3, at least so far, looks like it works. It's like Gemini, but better. I guess, Nick, let's throw this to you first. What's your initial impression of Gemini 3?
Yeah, I agree. It is Gemini, but better. You'd expect it to be better, after all. That is the kind of point. The way they pitched it to me recently was sort of the Gemini 1 family was about understanding. The Gemini 2 family was about thinking, and the Gemini 3 family is about action. So taking action. So this is where agentic and comes in, but it's obviously still reasoning model and all that kind of stuff. And I think some of the stuff that was pretty interesting was the Nana Banana being part of it. And there's been some really interesting images going around, actually interesting images right now from an enterprise AI point of view, not the usual stuff that we see of astronauts riding bicycles and things like that, but actually more its ability to create images that are useful in presentations, not necessarily presentations themselves, although it's probably getting there. And also, this kind of advanced planning capabilities and things like that. I've been digging into it a little bit. We're a kind of Google shop here at Futurum, so we've been using it a lot, as we all have, I know. But I think it's really interesting, and there's also there's other things around it. Maybe Brad want to talk about the anti-gravity and that came as part of it as well.
Yeah, it's a fascinating release for a lot of reasons, like Nick just mentioned. And it's funny, isn't it? It seems that now we have a cadence. Every year in early December, we get together and talk about all of the new groundbreaking, what do we call those? Frontier scale models that come out. And so I'm just waiting for the next DeepSeek to roll out before the end of the year. I'm sure it'll happen. But for Gemini, I find it interesting for a couple of reasons. First, to touch on the Nano Banana facet, Best name ever, by the
Yeah,
way,
I'm
for
sorry.
a
Can we
model.
just take a moment here and say,
Yes.
did you have Nano Banana and Anti-Gravity on your bingo card this week?
Right in the center. Yeah.
I mean, what's
Not
with
at
that?
all.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead, Brad. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like you mentioned, Stephen, with rolling it out in, with younger people, and those in research in particular, because Google has really shown in this year that amongst the US-based model makers that it is right there with Anthropic in terms of, bleeding edge, leading edge innovation. So I get that a lot. And Nano Banana is a good reflection of that because like Nick mentioned, it's not just about funny images. It's actually like if you're working in the enterprise and you're working to build software or maintain or manage software, think about what it means to have an image generation model that can actually output, correct syntax, correct grammar, correct English or whatever language, labeling for a very complex diagram of something, let's say, all the way down to wiring for or nano chip design, even. I say, I don't think that's out of the question, but think about what that means. If you can, instead of having to pivot over to a CAD CAM design, you can actually just have generative AI create a design that's consumable by software itself, other AI agents or just software. That's amazing. Think about it like at a really high level, just for building software. If you can actually create an interface that is, not just a sketch, but an actual, workable interface that can be broken apart by the model and built as software. That's amazing to me. So I think there's a lot of practicality with Nano Banana. The second thing that I want to touch on really quick is that we all need to bear in mind that it's not cheap or easy or fast to develop these frontier scale models, and that Gemini 3 is not actually a new model. Like Nick mentioned, this is all about tool use and refinements to an existing foundation. Meaning, like if you look at the date that the model says I was last trained on, like when the cutoff is for its knowledge within the corpus it was trained on, it's the same as 2.5, the end of 2024. So it's not an entirely new model. It's just doing a lot more with what it already had, and it is a lot more. I've experienced this as a practitioner working with Gemini daily, as a coding agent within Gemini CLI. That the biggest frustration I had with 2.5 was that it would run home to mama every chance it got in terms of coming up with a um, API calls for its own models that were from 2024. And so you're coding in the middle of 2025 and on. You're like, why are you doing this? And it's because the corpus was trained on that. Well, they've actually, made the model much better at not just using like MCP servers to do this, but actually better at, being able to sort of see the context of what you're working in so that it uses correct API calls. So I appreciate that about it a lot. And if I could just say one caveat also that I found with working with Gemini 3 is that it's not very chatty. I miss that. I liked 2.5 because it did do some glazing now and again, like, oh gosh, how did you come up with that great question? But you could look beyond that and instead really enjoy the fact that it would share with you some of its thinking and reasoning tokens about how it arrives at, oh, this is what I meant to do. This is what I need to do. This was a dead end. I tried this and it worked. You don't get that with 3. It's just all down to business. And the business is pretty good. So I guess I can take that as an acceptable downgrade.
That's pretty interesting. It's kind of like it's kind of like seeing a band where the lead singer doesn't talk between the songs. It's just the songs. That's all you're going to get.
That's right.
But
Ozzy Osbourne without the screaming to
exactly.
clap.
Exactly. I think it's interesting where we sit at the moment. This week, 2 days ago, it was ChatGPT's 3rd birthday, and how far we've come, and how also thinking back earlier this year, I can't really put an exact point on it, but somewhere in Q1 where, after DeepSeek came out in January and other things happened and OpenAI carried on its march, how Google was apparently doomed. And the ad search business was going to completely fall apart. And here we are, as Brad said, in December. And of the hyperscalers, I think it's fair to say it's looking like the one that's currently in the lead in terms of AI, from the chips to everything, to the apps at the up the top of the stack, and of course everything in between, which is where the real meat and potatoes is. But I think it's it's in a really interesting position.
Yeah, you can't count Microsoft out on that, but man, Google is doing everything right in the AI stack. It seems they have really solid models. We should probably also talk about anti-gravity versus Cursor, because Cursor 2.0 just came out with a lot of the same features, and anti-gravity is right there. But it is really interesting that Google is able to develop really solid, useful tools, get them out there to customers. I wonder about the financials of it, but I suspect, given what Nick just mentioned with Google's own silicon that they're using here, that those may not be as all that bad either, and that we may be seeing the emergence of a really solid offering here. One of the things, Brad, that I want to react to is one of my greatest frustrations with dealing with LLMs is the sort of compounding chaos that you get when you're trying to work with an LLM, because I don't just throw something at it and say, give me a result. I like to try to iterate over that and say, okay, that's good, but now this. And what I found, especially with the OpenAI models, is that it tends to spiral. It tends to compound, and you get just absolutely bananas, sorry, Google, results, especially when it came to ChatGPT's image generation. It would really just go off a cliff after 4 or 5 images, and you'd end up with something that just was completely wrong. And I would have to basically say, forget this, let's go back to the start and try that all again. So far, I haven't experienced that as much in Gemini 3. And I'm curious if you all, first off, have you experienced this, or am I just inept? And second
No,
off,
you were. Yeah,
is this
sorry.
something that's getting better?
No,
Yes
you're
and
totally
no.
right. You're totally right. I mean, that spiraling of images to the fact that you completely reset and say, this is all completely useless, let's start again. Or often what you end up doing in those situations is going to another, going to Claude or going somewhere else and just trying something, and then getting frustrated and then building the slide yourself from scratch. But I think I think these things are, they are. I mean, I guess the thing is, we're always told they're only going to get better, but they do get better, but they get better when the next version comes out. And so, because because I always say your stuff is not being used to retrain that model. And, obviously, as Brad talked about earlier, the cutoff date proves that it's not being retrained. So, you do kind of have to wait for the new version. But I think it's, I was actually playing with the new Claude Optus 4.5 earlier today, and it's the first one I found that actually, I mean, talking from an analyst building slides a lot, so there's a very kind of narrow point of view. It's the first one that actually built a slide, a proper one, a PowerPoint slide. I mean, what we use Google Sheets, but in PowerPoint format, that it was actually good and all the words were correct on it, and and all those kind of things. So I think, in terms of personal productivity, for me, that's huge. But I think the image stuff is, it's always the first thing to be publicized, isn't it? Because everybody wants to, put out all the silly stuff. But I think it's going to be really, really useful in all sorts of, the creative industries, but also everybody else who's not a creative professional but is a knowledge worker of any kind.
Yeah, very true. The first thing I always use these models for is to work on designs, airbrush designs for my 1970s panel van, the ones with the little half moon windows in the back.
How many panel vans do you got now, Brad?
um, it's the same for all use cases for these, whatever, if it's a multimodal or reasoning or just a use trained. I'm trying to think of the word now. Sorry, a basic chat response model. It doesn't matter. It's the same because we're getting better at how we handle context windows, how big they can be, and we're getting better at the attention mechanisms we have that tell the model how to work with the content it sees in those. And so, like you're describing, Stephen, the challenge often when you're working with these, and this is especially the case for agentic development, is that the further you get into a session, the less likely you are to end up where you thought you were going to go. And it's like, I kind of think of it. It's a human. It's the same as a human being in terms of fatigue sets in, confusion sets in, conflicting ideas set in, waiting sets in. Like, well, what's the most important thing in this huge context window? Oh my goodness, how do you know that? And so, and I say this, Nick's probably sick of hearing me talk about it, because we do internally all the time, and that is that it's not about prompt engineering. It's all about context engineering. You really have to be very careful about how you put data in front of a model in the context of what you're asking it to do. Because the more we work with these, the more I have found that um, the we ask more of them, and therefore they do less until the next iteration, next Christmas comes around. So you kind of have to, be very cautious about how you use them. For me, like working agentically for software development, my best friend is the / compress command to take everything everything that's gone into that conversation and compress it down. Two things that does. First is it saves me a ton of money. And the second is it keeps the model from going off the rails, or less likely to go off the rails. The other is simply just cut it off, just clear the cache, clear the memory, and start over, because there are limits. The more we ask of these, the less they're able to do, honestly, until we figure out how to do it better.
Yeah, the frustrating thing for me is, when you're in there and, you literally will say, okay, keep this part the same and fix this other thing. And I've experienced this with coding assistants, I've experienced this with writing, and I've experienced this with image generation, like crazy with image generation. You'll say, like, okay, I like that part, keep that the same. Now let's modify this other part. And somehow it will change that part too. And with coding assistants, that can be especially pernicious because you can find that the function that was working and that you got done with before is suddenly off the rails again. Has anyone tried Coding Assistant with Gemini 3 anti-gravity? I guess
I
some.
have.
Have you?
I've spent some time with it. And I I wasn't actually that anxious to use it because I'm not a fan of Electron, and I really loathe VS Code, because it's really just JavaScript with plugins all day long. I like something like Zed that's sort of purpose built to be a code, an IDE. And anyway, but my preferences aside, I was very surprised, at just how good it was at getting to an outcome. That outcome. If I say a very simple prompt, make me a Pomodoro timer, it will just set up my environment, get everything in order, like an actual, like, good working order, not just half witted sort of, a POC that you would not want to share with anyone because you'd be too embarrassed to show them, but actually good coding practices to get there. But I just don't, it's not something that I think is fully baked yet, and it's got a long ways to go. And I think it also opens up a lot of potential issues for us because of its use of what we have come to know as browser use or computer use, where models are given the ability to work with your system itself. I mean, with these coding agents, we already give them access to RM / tilde tilde RM, to delete everything. But it's like that with you just handing the reins over to the horse and saying, "Take me home or drag me through trees. Let's go for the former." Okay.
You got a lot of metaphors in there. First off, I think you're going to have to use Nano Tomato to design the UI for your Pomodoro timer. Also, fully baked pasta is delicious, especially with Pomodoro. And we actually went down to Amish country this weekend here in Ohio, and the horse absolutely can take you home when you're drunk, in the middle of the night.
That is a dangerous practice, sir.
But I'd let you know. But Nick, let's talk about coding and browser use. I think browser use is one of those things that people are a little shy about.
Yeah, I mean, do you mean shy about admitting they're using it, or shy about or wanting to actually get started with it? Yeah, I think.
Do I really want to turn my browser over to Gemini?
Yeah, and I guess they're all pushing you. Perplexity's pushing you, and they're all pushing you. OpenAI's all pushing you to do that. Yeah, there's obviously these kind of core security risks of the the kind of the kind of what was it indirect prompt injection and things like that. I think it's interesting, because we're kind of back to the 90s again, aren't we? With browser wars. I think we're all old enough to remember Netscape and IE and all the others that were around. I think I think there's going to be I think it's going to be pushback on the corporate level anyway, and corporate IT on those kind of things. I mean, there's only so much shadow AI you can get away with in a large corporation. I mean, smaller companies, then yeah, I think people will. I mean, obviously the switching costs then become so high, don't they? Because if you're investing in, if that becomes your browser, and obviously that becomes incredibly sticky, that's obviously why the vendors want to do it. So you just don't like we've been discussing earlier. You don't just go, well, I'm not going to use that image generator anymore. I'm going to jump over here and use this one. But I think at the moment we're still very, very early in how effective this stuff is, which is we've just talked about for the last 15 minutes. That people will not probably want to commit to I'm only going to go down this road because as it's impressive as say Gemini 3 is, there'll be another state of the art model along in a minute, and so you want to try it surely. And so I think it's I think people are going to want to be more flexible for a while yet.
Yeah, I feel like we're entering a new phase with development in particular. That it's not, with agentic development in particular. You remember how we were talking about vibe coding that Karpathy came up with last year, and vibe coding is now just AI coding or just even coding. We're moving very rapidly toward new ways of building software in the enterprise, and as we do that, like Nick is saying, you've only got so much tolerance for risk in the enterprise, and you don't go beyond that. And if shadow AI is threatening it, it gets locked down pretty quick. So these tools are evolving rapidly to really match those requirements. And I've seen it with some interesting recent agentic tooling like we had, and I just cannot believe this name. I'm not going to say better than Nano Banana, but on par with Nano Banana, and that is Bob from IBM. Bob is an IDE built for agentic development. And Bob likes literate programming, if you've ever heard of that, and also spec-driven development. And those two things together, those two ideas are really informing the maturation of coding with agentic tools right now. And
I can't believe that Microsoft let the trademark on Bob lapse, so IBM picked it up.
That because it was such a success. Absolutely.
Yes, exactly,
right.
Yeah, but so tell us more about that, Brad. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an old idea. As we've been talking about it. It's old ideas come around, old problems come back around, and I think we'll talk about those in a minute with Microsoft. But back in the 70s, a guy named Knuth with a K came up with this idea of literate programming, where you could mix natural instructions for the program with actual code, and sort of treat that as a paradigm for developing software that was useful for both humans and machines. And what we kind of came up with from that was what everyone that's into data science knows so fondly as Jupyter Notebooks. Not directly, but indirectly, it sort of led to that idea, I'm saying. And that is now evolving and maturing in tools like Bob to sort of prioritize the thing that all developers hate the most, which is documentation and explaining their code. And as we have discovered over the last few years, what are these tools really good at? These agentic, LLMs really good at? They are really good at parsing long strings of data, making sense of it, and documenting it for us. So ideas like literate programming kind of make your agentic experience, like I was talking about with Gemini CLI and the non-chatty version of Gemini. It makes it into a sort of how do I put this? Sort of like self-documenting software development, in which you can have this auditable sort of time slice of how something was created that can be audited later and used like a black box later to make software better, more secure, more performant, etc. So those are great ideas. And the spec thing, the spec driven development is simply know what you're doing before you ask an agentic tool to write your Pomodoro timer for you. And it's just start with good documentation, be clear, make this a project, make this less of vibe coding and more of just coding.
Maybe we should talk about the other hyperscaler with the big news, Microsoft.
Yeah.
Because there was recently Microsoft Ignite was held recently in San Francisco. I was there with a couple of other Futurum analysts. I thought it was interesting. Keynotes, I'm not a massive fan of keynotes because they're very very well scripted and everything else. But I thought this one was interesting. It was interesting partly because who was not there. Satya Nadella was not there, and obviously this goes to part of his the announcements they made a few months ago, where he's going to focus more on AI and also more on internal issues, and he left it all over to Judd Altoff, the CEO of the commercial business, and it was interesting how Microsoft does have some models, but Microsoft has obviously been leaning on OpenAI for its frontier models. It's not a frontier model provider really. It's an enabler, and Azure, through Azure. But so many of the announcements and the keynote, for instance, went on for about 2.25 hours. Up until about the last 10 minutes, it was all about software, which you probably think, well, Nick, Microsoft's a software company. But so many things we go to, even some elements of companies like Salesforce who've never talked about infrastructure, are talking about infrastructure. So it's quite revealing. I think they understand where their sweet spot obviously is, Microsoft this is. It's obviously in developers, but also enterprise users of all kinds. And I think that was evident in the topics and the things that they announced. It wasn't until right at the end they started talking about infrastructure. The other thing that was unusual about it slightly was the lack of customers until sort of later on. There was a couple of fireside chats, one with Mercedes and another customer, and all the rest of it they were using a fake company. They said this is a made up company called Zava. And they were using their own engineers to kind of play the role of somebody at this company, where they could be in advertising or marketing of that company, and they're doing demos like that. Which, if I'm being nice and fair to Microsoft, they're obviously doing it partly because it's very very early in terms of customer adoption. And obviously some of the things they're announcing obviously weren't announced until that very day, which has also happened to be the same day that Google announced Gemini 3. So I think it was an interesting reflection of where Microsoft is versus where AWS is, which is reInvent this week, versus where Google is.
Yeah, I was lurking from afar, and from my vantage point, I found it also interesting about that in-house use cases, and I think it, as you mentioned, Nick, it really speaks to the fact that Microsoft is looking a bit further forward than sometimes we get from them, and you could see that really reflected in some of their announcements. Well, it's always give and take. The give part is they announced this preview of what they call Fabric IQ, which just sounds like, oh, intelligent quotient, that must be really smart, and indeed it is. It's trying to bring some sort of semantic meaning to your data estate, which we could talk about as much as you guys want, but the balance to that was they came out with their own version of a PostgreSQL database called Horizon DB, which everybody and their cousin has a version of Postgres. That's why it's the world's most popular relational database. And the fact that Microsoft announced this as a part of Fabric, which they hinges on their idea of OneLake, which is a data lakehouse. It's like Databricks and somewhat Snowflake. It's to say that we want a very flexible data platform that separates storage and compute as much as we can, and leans heavily toward what we all love right now about bringing data to AI, and that's unstructured data. But you kind of need to pay attention to operational data. So I feel like at once they're trying to leap way ahead with Fabric IQ, and they're also trying to be very grounded in what they're doing for existing customers to help bring them forward on this journey. Because if you just made Fabric, just all about the data lakehouse and don't really try to bridge that long-standing gap between analytics and operational data estates, you're gonna just always end up with in-house customers, and you won't have any real ones.
Yeah.
And then can I just touch on the other two IQs? They announced one called Work IQ, one called Foundry IQ. The Work IQ one was much more of the kind of the M365 user and Copilot, and this is sort of pulling everything from the graph, the knowledge graph that Microsoft's been building for years, plus the memory and context. And this is aiming at agents. If I'm working, it'll know what documents I've opened, who I've been emailing, who I've been chatting to in Teams, and all that kind of stuff, and it brings it all together. The Foundry is slightly different from the other two. The other two, Fabric and Work IQ, are kind of bounded by the kind of data they are looking at for very good reason. Foundry is the one that can kind of go anywhere else, including the web, and it's based on Azure AI search. So it's kind of, in some ways, is the evolution of enterprise search, the great kind of undelivered promise of IT over the last 30 or 40 years. But I think, Foundry is a very interesting approach. And they also announced Agent Factory and Agent 365, the latter being their kind of agentic control plane, which is going to be, I think, very, very important for any kind of agentic orchestration is going to be massive over the next couple of years. So that was the other two things or three things I just wanted to point out.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And, I honestly, I feel like we could have probably talked a lot more about Ignite here. I think for me, the big news was that they didn't use Contoso as their sample company. Very disappointed to hear that. So Microsoft actually has dozens of sample companies they've used in the past. I guess, Google told us that Contoso switched to Google Workspace a few years back.
How'd it go?
They did make that press release. So those of you who don't know what we're talking about here, I don't know, Google it or something. You'll find it. Bing it. Yeah. So, and of course, one more thing we do have to mention, this episode goes live during AWS reInvent. So, in fact, Brad and Nick, I think both of you are at reInvent as well, right? So, we will be talking about reInvent news probably for a little while, because we've given Google quite a lot of love here for Gemini. We've given Microsoft quite a lot of love for what they announced at Ignite. But of course, I guess who expects that AWS is going to sit on their hands? I mean, what do you anticipate at this point to be the big takeaways from reInvent?
Yeah, more of what Nick just mentioned. Agent orchestration all day, every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and with Agent Core, I think is what they're branding it from AWS, and it's such a critical aspect right now, because as one of the reasons why Microsoft came out with Fabric IQ, and it's the same thing we're getting from Snowflake with Snowflake Intelligence, and from Salesforce with their Agent Force. Is all about how you bring semantic meaning to the data, to bring the right context to these models. But it's not just about that. It's about how do you actually bring together these autonomous or semi-autonomous elements in a way that are non-deterministic, but still deterministic enough to get the outcome you want in a sort of reasonable manner, without exposing you to a ton of risk and without costing an arm and a leg. And that's all about orchestration. So that's what we expect to see a lot of from them.
And also, I do expect to see more infrastructure. There will be chip announcements, I assume, from AWS. So we're dragging us back down the stack down to that. I'm sure there'll be that. I mean, it's a big, as we were kind of alluding to earlier. If you can train your own models on your own silicon, it's a big cost advantage. And I think both AWS and Google are seeing that to a greater or lesser extent. If they don't have to keep shelling out for NVIDIA GPUs, then that's a big advantage for them. So expect more of that, and we'll be revisiting reInvent for quite a while after it's finished, I'm sure.
Yeah, Nick's right about the hardware thing. We can't forget it, can we? Because apparently Oracle was right along with Exadata and vertical integration being kind of a useful thing, and we've seen it proven time and again with NVIDIA. And that is that, vertical integration leads to optimizations that lets you do a lot more than if you're just white boxing it all day with just scale out, for trying to solve your problems. And with AI in particular, there are a lot of bottlenecks that show up in places like networking and in places like storage, and so that's why we see all of the, networking and hardware, storage, server, et cetera, vendors all leaning really hard right now on creating this sort of integration stack of optimization.
Yep, absolutely. And for that matter, we just last week heard about Nokia announcing that they're going to be the providing networking connectivity for AI models. They're investing $5 billion to have made in America networking hardware to support these things. I mean, there's all sorts of investment happening down at the infrastructure layer, and as Nick points out, I definitely that's my focus. So I'll be keeping an eye on that. We do have to wrap this week, though. So thank you both for joining us. Before we run, though, since, again, it is reInvent week for our listeners when they're listening to this, where can they find your coverage and reactions to reInvent? Brad?
Oh, well, I'll be on LinkedIn at Brad Shimmin, all one word, and all of the traditional Futurum outlets, meaning futurum.com, et cetera.
All right, Nick?
Yeah, same. I'd be at LinkedIn at Nick Patience. I don't use X a lot, but I'm at Nick Patience on that, and Blue Sky, and also futurumgroup.com. We'll be writing notes for our clients and everybody else on what we see at reInvent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to be watching it as well. You'll find me at S Foskett on most social media networks. I'm using Blue Sky a lot lately. Maybe head over there. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of the Utilizing AI podcast. If you enjoyed the discussion, please do subscribe. You'll find us on YouTube as well as in your favorite podcast application. And also, we'd love to hear from you if you want to give us a rating or review. This podcast is brought to you by analysts and experts from the Futurum Group, where insights meet AI. For show notes and more episodes, head over to techstrong.ai, the Utilizing AI YouTube channel, or the TechStrong TV app. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next week.